Hey, how's it going, guys? We're going to be doing How Europeans Almost Divided Australia history reaction today, guys. So, by the channel, Fire of Learning, and we're going to check it out. I know that England had like discovered part of Australia, the Netherlands discovered part of Australia. I don't know who else. It showed like three different ones on the thumbnail. So, we're going to check it out right here. Links to the original video will be in the description section down below, as always. And we're going to jump into it. We're going to find out how Europeans almost divided Australia.
In the year 1606, the Dutch explorer Willem Janszoon and his crew stepped foot on a mysterious land. Though he and his men did not know it, they had just stumbled upon a new world, the Fifth World, the land we today know as Australia.
Fifth
Yet,
world, huh?
unlike the Spanish in the Americas or the Portuguese in Asia, the Dutch would be slow to explore this new land and would not attempt to colonize the area. Nor would any other European nation immediately scramble to do so for that matter. The first genuine European settlement in Australia was not founded until 1788, almost 200 years after its discovery by Europeans,
I didn't know it was that recent. Wow.
when the British began to settle the southeast. Once they had begun, Britain would not face genuine competition from other Europeans on a landmass almost as large as Europe itself, and by 1827 had laid claim to the whole thing, challenged only by the indigenous groups of Australia. This seems
Yeah, yeah. They're probably pissed. I mean, yeah, of course they were. I mean, jeez.
odd, given that, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, Europeans were vigorously competing with each other to claim lands all over the globe. What did other European powers think about establishing their own colonies in Australia, and if they did have plans to, why did only Britain go through with them? Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. In this video we'll find
Good
out, so
question.
let's get to it.
Why did Britain the
As
only one that
mentioned,
went through
the
it?
Dutch were the first Europeans to reach Australia. The Spanish coincidentally arrived only months later, and the Portuguese were quite active in the southeast of the globe as well, with
Okay.
unproven claims even that they may have been there first. Each of these countries could have colonized Australia, even Spain, which was willing to break its agreement with Portugal to stay out of the East when they felt they could, but none of them did.
And why is that? Well, we're gonna find out, right?
In fact, it would be quite some time before they were even sure of what Australia even was. Early explorers like Janszoon only came into contact with certain areas. In fact, his knowledge was so limited that he assumed Australia was somehow a part of the island of New Guinea. It would
Yeah.
take another 40 years before explorers like Abel Tasman gave Europeans a better idea of what the whole area looked like. Why not make an effort to colonize the area at this point? Well, given enough time, they may very well have, but the simple answer is that at this time, the 17th century, there were more promising opportunities elsewhere. There was a whole world, from the Americas to Africa to Asia, to explore, settle, and conquer in
Have that same map.
this time. Areas which were more profitable, closer to home, and/or more hospitable. Indeed, multiple explorers, from Janszoon to Tasman to others, regarded the land as unpromising. Thus, with the exception of a number of prominent explorers, the Europeans who did come into contact with Australia in the 17th century did so while passing through the area to get somewhere else, in particular the Dutch traveling to the very lucrative East Indies. The Dutch would name Australia after land in
New Holland. That was the original name. Well, after Europeans, I mean, I don't know what the indigenous people called it, but
their own country, though, calling it New Holland, which remained the name for Australia until the British changed it in the 19th century. In the 18th century, when the area was better understood, the subject of colonizing Australia was brought up to the Dutch specifically. Officials from the Dutch East India Company responded by saying, quote, "There is no prospect of use or benefit to the company in it, but rather very certain and heavy costs." End quote.
I mean, I could see that. I mean, it does look like a barren wasteland, when you just first look at it. But I mean, there's a lot of gold there, right? There's a lot of resources. Obviously, it's been built up into a massive economy at this point. You know what I mean? So they just didn't see it for what it was, right? Or what it could be.
This position is especially understandable when it is remembered that the areas of Australia with which Europeans were the most familiar at the time were the north and west. Much of this area is not quite as attractive or fertile as the land in the southeast, which is where most of the population of Australia lives to this day, in fact. Furthermore, as mentioned, there was no clear benefit to commerce. Australia had no obvious wealth and was out of the way of the major trade routes. There are claims of shipwrecked survivors making a home out of Australia, some of whom may have even been assimilated into the local tribes, but this is a separate story
Interesting.
for another time.
Another time. I wonder if they did that video. Let me know, guys.
This answers only part of the question. The following century, the empires of the Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese had entered into a decline, while the British and French gradually outpaced them. The European empires were growing larger and extending farther. It became inevitable that someone would reach for Australia eventually. In the latter half of the 18th century, both Britain and France suffered considerable setbacks in the Americas. France lost much of its North American territory to Britain in 1763. 2 decades later, Britain lost a large share of its territory there as well when it recognized the independence of 13 of its colonies. Both of these nations would try to compensate for these losses. In this effort, both Britain and France found Australia more and more interesting. Prominent citizens of both countries began to increasingly call for further exploration and a colony, and, as we shall see, Britain and France would not be alone. In 1770, the British explorer James Cook explored the eastern coast of Australia and would claim it for Britain. In 1772, the French explorer Louis-Aleno de Saint-Ouen claimed the west coast of Australia for France. It might have appeared that Britain and France were squaring up for another showdown at this point. However, these were, for the moment, just claims, no colonies. The British, however, would, not long after, act. They established the first permanent European settlement in Australia in 1788. This colony would be a penal colony, though it's worth mentioning that the British intended more for Australia than for it to just be a place to dump their prisoners. Indeed, the prisoners who were sent to Australia were employed in developing the colony into a proper piece of the empire.
I heard that story, though, that it was just a bunch of prisoners being dumped there. I don't know if that, maybe it's not true. I don't know.
The French had similar ambitions. Given the amount of attention the French gave to Australia, it seems entirely possible that they would have followed the British there. An example of French interest can be seen in the La Perouse expedition that reached Australia in 1788. However, the French soon found themselves distracted. The French Revolution erupted a year later. It would set in motion events that would disrupt France's colonial efforts for nearly 30 years.
Oh, I bet.
Though the threat of French settlement remained throughout this period, it was lightened, and ultimately, France never did follow up on their claims to Western Australia. The French Revolution, therefore, perhaps totally changed the course of Australian history. Still, this didn't mean Australia...
The French Revolution. Interesting. I didn't expect that to have such a big impact on it. It's crazy how history, like, it's just how everything just, it's just crazy how it works. You know what I mean? It's just nuts. I mean, you know, one thing leads to another, and then now we have stuff happening nowadays, and one little thing could have been different. It'd be a whole nother story. It's just crazy.
Australia was assured to be as British as it would become quite yet. Other European powers looked to Australia as well, such as everyone would guess, well, maybe not,
The
Sweden.
Dutch? Oh no, Sweden.
In 1786, 2 years before Britain established their colony, the Swedish King Gustav III, working with a man named William Bolts, drew up plans to set up a colony in the Eastern Seas. Gustav was interested in establishing overseas colonies for Sweden throughout his reign, and therefore Bolts, an adventurous merchant with an expertise in the East, did not find it hard to persuade him of the ambitious plan he brought before him. The Swedes planned to found a settlement on an island which would be called Boltsholm. The specific island in question was kept secret, never named in writing.
Is it Tasmania now? Right? Is it Tasmania? Because isn't that island right there? That'd be kind of cool, right?
It was said to be, again, in the eastern seas, specifically the southern Indian Ocean, unsettled, and larger than the islands of Mauritius and Reunion put together. It may have been quite a bit larger, with his intention in fact being to settle the Australian mainland. Regardless of whether or not it was Australia, Bolts made open reference to the opportunity this colony could bring in the future for the Swedish in terms of exploiting the resources of Australia. He compared Australia to Peru or Mexico in terms of the potential untapped wealth that could be there.
Yeah, so he was talking about Australia. I thought he meant an island off of Australia, not Australia being the island earlier. That's why I was thinking Tasmania, but all right. I think.
He likely had in mind Swedish expansion into the area that today surrounds the cities of Fremantle and Perth. This was quite a bold move for Sweden, a nation which had seen their empire decline in the past century, and which had not been very successful in its past overseas colonial efforts. But the Swedish were quite serious about it. However, in 1788, war broke out with Russia and Denmark.
Uh-oh.
Sweden could not afford to be distracted with such exotic ventures during this war, and the plans were abandoned. How well such a venture would have worked out, we'll never know.
Very
Once
interesting.
again, chance may have completely altered the course of Australian history, but it was not over yet. Though the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars distracted France from his colonial ambitions, it did not totally halt them. Napoleon himself showed a small amount of interest in Australia, ordering an expedition to survey the coastline, and may have even wished to claim part of it. There were even plans made by the Spanish to attack and capture the British colony in Australia, which were never realized and, admittedly, probably would not have worked for long. Furthermore, following the Napoleonic Wars, other European nations revived their interest in the region, namely France. To prevent these rivals from gaining a foothold, Britain would quickly move to claim the rest of the island in the 1820s,
Very
establishing
interesting.
more westerly settlements like Albany. The British may have moved in the nick of time, as the French sailor and advocate of Australian colonization, Dumont d'Urville, was exploring the area at the same time. Why not claim the whole thing to begin with? A couple of reasons. One of which is that, while Britain was not afraid to challenge the French, it seems a number of Brits involved in the venture, including Cook himself, were uncertain of whether the Dutch intended to claim the western areas they had discovered, and wanted to respect any claim they might have had.
Okay.
So, in summary, it could be argued that the reason Britain was not challenged by other colonial powers in Australia is that the period in which it first became advantageous for European empires to colonize Australia coincided with a period in which Britain was the only nation realistically able to do so. Britain capitalized on this opportunity and claimed the entire thing before the other colonial empires could catch.
Very, very interesting. That's crazy how that worked out. And they were afraid, like they're like they thought the Dutch were on that side. They're like, I don't want to mess with you guys. You know, we respect you. They didn't even want it. It was just unclaimed for a while. Man, crazy how things work out, right?
Catch up. Once established, Britain was too dangerous to challenge, and there was not much interest in challenging them anyway in the relatively peaceful Victorian era. Were Australia colonized before or after the period of 1770 to 1830, it may very well have been divided between multiple different powers. As a side note, the other powers of Europe didn't exactly go home empty-handed. As mentioned, the Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese already occupied much of Southeast Asia. The French would settle other nearby territories, namely New Caledonia and French Polynesia, and the Germans would claim part of New Guinea. Furthermore, one could argue France did have an equivalent of Australia, French Guiana, in South America, though this was much smaller, and as we discussed in my video explaining why France still owns part of South America to this day, that did not go so very well.
Okay.
I hope you enjoyed this video.
It didn't go
If so, I invite you
now I
to
wanna
check
see
out
it.
the rest of Fire.
Awesome, guys. So that was it Fire of Learning? Yeah. Interesting channel, actually. In fact, I'm going to subscribe. You guys probably should as well. Links to the original video will be in the description section. I learned a lot. Let me know what you guys learned. Until then, I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care. Have a super fun, awesome day. Later.